By the 1770s, tensions between Great Britain and its American colonies had reached a breaking point. Years of new taxes, trade restrictions, and what colonists saw as violations of their rights had created a powder keg of resentment and anger. British troops had been stationed in Boston to maintain order, leading to clashes like the Boston Massacre in 1770, where soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 saw colonists dump hundreds of chests of British tea into the harbor to protest the Tea Act. Britain responded with punitive measures the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port and curtailing Massachusetts' self-government. Colonial militias began training and stockpiling weapons. Both sides were preparing for conflict, though many still hoped for reconciliation. That fragile hope shattered in the early morning hours of April 19th, 1775. When the opening shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. British General Thomas Gage had received orders to seize military supplies that colonial militias had stored in Concord and to arrest rebel leaders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. On the night of April 18th, about 700 British soldiers marched out of Boston toward Concord. But the colonists had an intelligence network, and riders including Paul Revere and William Dawes raced ahead to warn the countryside that the British were coming. By the time the British reached Lexington Green at dawn, about 70 colonial militiamen were assembled to confront them. The British commander ordered the militia to disperse. Someone fired a shot. To this day, no one knows which side fired first, whether it was a British soldier, a militiaman, or perhaps an accidental discharge. But that single shot, immortalized as the shot heard round the world, sparked a battle. The British fired volleys into the militia, killing 8 and wounding 10. The Redcoats then marched on to Concord, where they found and destroyed some military supplies. But by now, militiamen were streaming in from surrounding towns, hundreds and then thousands of them. At the North Bridge in Concord, militia engaged the British in a fierce firefight. The British began their march back to Boston, and that march became a nightmare. Colonial militiamen lined the road, firing from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings, using frontier fighting tactics against soldiers trained for European-style warfare. The British retreat became a running battle, with casualties mounting. By the time the exhausted Redcoats reached the safety of Boston, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties, while colonial forces had lost fewer than 100. The war had begun. There would be no turning back now. The colonists and the British Empire were at war. In the wake of Lexington and Concord, colonial militias laid siege to Boston, trapping the British Army in the city. Colonial leaders realized they needed to coordinate their efforts to transform scattered militias into a unified fighting force. The Second Continental Congress, which had convened in Philadelphia in May 1775, took on this task. The delegates came from 12 of the 13 colonies, with Georgia joining later. They were lawyers, merchants, planters, men of property and education, but they were about to become revolutionaries. In June 1775, the Congress took the momentous step of creating the Continental Army, bringing together militia forces from different colonies under a single command. They needed a commander-in-chief, someone with military experience, leadership ability, and the respect of all the colonies. The choice fell on George Washington of Virginia. Washington was 43 years old, a wealthy planter and veteran of the French and Indian War. He was tall, imposing, and carried himself with natural authority. He was from the South, which was important politically, as it helped ensure that the fight wouldn't be seen as just a New England rebellion. Washington accepted the command with humility, refusing to take a salary and asking only that his expenses be covered. He rode north to Massachusetts to take command of the army besieging Boston. Washington would lead the Continental Army for the entire 8 years of the war, through devastating defeats and remarkable victories, through winters when his soldiers went barefoot in the snow, and times when the army nearly dissolved for lack of pay. His leadership, his steadiness under pressure, and his unwavering commitment to the cause would be essential to American victory. He became the indispensable man of the Revolution, and his service would make him the obvious choice as the first president of the new nation. As the war raged, with battles fought from Massachusetts to Georgia, the Continental Congress grappled with a fundamental question. What exactly were they fighting for? At first, many colonists hoped for reconciliation with Britain, for a return to the way things had been before the new taxes and restrictions. But as the war continued and British actions became harsher, including the burning of towns and the use of German mercenaries called Hessians, sentiment shifted toward full independence. In June 1776, Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution stating that the colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration. The committee included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, a 33-year-old lawyer and planter from Virginia, known for his elegant writing, was chosen to draft the document. He worked in a rented room in Philadelphia, drawing on Enlightenment philosophy, particularly John Locke's ideas about natural rights, and on his own understanding of the colonists' grievances. The document he produced was remarkable, a powerful statement of universal principles, combined with a specific indictment of King George III. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," Jefferson wrote, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The declaration went on to list the king's offenses and to declare that the colonies were now free and independent states. The Congress debated the declaration, making some changes, most notably removing Jefferson's passage condemning slavery, which Southern delegates refused to accept. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence. Church bells rang out across Philadelphia. The document was printed and distributed, read aloud in town squares and to assembled troops. July 4th became the birthday of a new nation, though the war to secure that independence was far from over. The Declaration transformed the conflict from a rebellion over taxes into a war for fundamental human rights and self-determination, and it articulated ideals that would inspire revolutionary movements around the world for centuries to come. But declaring independence and actually achieving it were two very different things. The Americans faced the most powerful military in the world, the British Army and Navy, with professional soldiers, modern weapons, and vast resources, The Continental Army, by contrast, was perpetually short of everything: weapons, ammunition, uniforms, food, money, and often men, as militia terms expired and soldiers went home. Washington suffered a series of defeats in 1776, losing New York City and retreating across New Jersey. By December, the army was on the verge of disintegration. Washington took a desperate gamble, crossing the icy Delaware River on Christmas night and attacking a garrison of Hessian soldiers at Trenton, New Jersey. The surprise victory provided a much-needed morale boost, but the war continued to go poorly. The British captured Philadelphia in 1777, forcing Congress to flee. Then came a turning point. In October 1777, American forces under General Horatio Gates surrounded and defeated a British army at Saratoga, New York. The Battle of Saratoga is often called the turning point of the Revolution, not because it was the largest battle or caused the most casualties, but because of its diplomatic consequences. The victory proved to European powers, particularly France, that the Americans could actually win. France had been watching the conflict with interest, still bitter about its losses in the 7 Years' War, and eager to weaken Britain. But the French were hesitant to support what looked like a losing cause. Saratoga changed the calculation. In February 1778, France formally allied with the United States, providing military support, supplies, money, and most importantly, the French Navy, which could challenge British naval supremacy. French officers, soldiers, and ships would play crucial roles in the war's final campaigns. Spain and the Netherlands also entered the war against Britain, forcing the British to defend their interests around the globe, not just in North America. Saratoga transformed the American Revolution from a colonial rebellion into a world war, and that transformation made American victory possible. The alliance with France brought hope, but it didn't end the suffering. The winter of 1777 to 1778 would become legendary as one of the darkest periods of the war. The Continental Army, numbering around 12,000 men, went into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, about 20 miles northwest of British-occupied Philadelphia. It should have been a time to rest and recover, but it became a nightmare of deprivation. The soldiers lacked adequate clothing, with many having no shoes or coats despite the bitter cold. They lacked food, going days with little more than fire cake, a mixture of flour and water baked over fires. They lacked shelter, living in crude log huts that provided little protection from the elements. Disease swept through the camp: typhus, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia, killing an estimated 2,000 men that winter. Soldiers wrapped rags around their feet and left bloody footprints in the snow. Some deserted, unable to endure any longer. Washington pleaded with Congress and the states for supplies, for money, for anything to help his suffering army. Slowly, conditions improved as spring approached. And during that terrible winter, something important happened. A Prussian military officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge. Von Steuben was a veteran of the elite Prussian army, one of the best trained military forces in Europe. He had been recruited by Benjamin Franklin in Paris and sent to help the Americans. Von Steuben took charge of training the Continental Army, drilling the soldiers in European military tactics, teaching them how to march in formation, load and fire their muskets more efficiently, and use bayonets in close combat. He worked tirelessly, demonstrating the movements himself despite the language barrier, since he spoke little English and had to work through translators. He created a training manual, the regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States, which became the Army's standard drill manual. By the time the Army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, it was transformed. The ragged collection of militia and volunteers had become a professional fighting force, capable of standing toe-to-toe with British regulars. Valley Forge became a symbol of perseverance, of suffering endured for a greater cause, and a testament to Washington's leadership and the dedication of the soldiers who stayed when they could have gone home. The war continued for 3 more years after Valley Forge, with major fighting shifting to the southern colonies. The British captured Savannah and Charleston and won victories in the Carolinas. But American forces under generals like Nathanael Greene fought a brilliant campaign of attrition, avoiding major battles while wearing down British forces with quick strikes and guerrilla tactics. And the French alliance began to pay dividends. In 1781, the war reached its climax at Yorktown, Virginia. British General Lord Cornwallis had marched his army to Yorktown, a small tobacco port on the York River, planning to establish a naval base and resupply his forces. But the situation quickly turned disastrous for the British. Washington, in New York with the main Continental Army, learned of Cornwallis's position and made a bold decision. He would march south and trap Cornwallis at Yorktown. Simultaneously, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse would sail north from the Caribbean to cut off any British escape by sea. The plan required precise coordination and a bit of luck. It worked. Washington marched his army and French forces under General Rochambeau south in a rapid, secret movement. They arrived at Yorktown in late September and laid siege to the British positions. De Grasse's fleet defeated a British naval force in the Battle of the Chesapeake, ensuring that the Royal Navy could not evacuate or resupply Cornwallis. Trapped between the American and French armies on land and the French fleet at sea, with no hope of relief, Cornwallis found his position hopeless. On October 19, 1781, after several weeks of siege and bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army of more than 7,000 men. The British band reportedly played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," a fitting choice for an event that seemed to reverse the natural order, with a collection of rebellious colonists defeating the British Empire. Yorktown effectively ended major fighting in the Revolutionary War. Though the war would not officially end for another 2 years, and though British forces still occupied New York and other cities, everyone knew that Britain had lost. There would be no more major campaigns. The Americans, with essential help from France, Spain, and the Netherlands, had won their independence. Yorktown brought military victory, but the new nation still needed formal recognition and a peace treaty. Negotiations took place in Paris and dragged on for nearly 2 years. The American delegation included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, all skilled diplomats. The British were in no hurry, hoping the alliance between America and France might fracture, but the Americans negotiated skillfully, sometimes playing Britain and France against each other. Finally, on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially ending the Revolutionary War. The treaty recognized American independence and granted the new United States territory reaching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and from the Great Lakes to the Spanish colony of Florida in the south. It was an enormous territory, far larger than the 13 original colonies, and it contained the potential for westward expansion that would define the nation's future. Britain also agreed to withdraw its troops from American soil, though this would take longer than promised, with some British forts remaining occupied into the 1790s. The treaty was generous to the United States, perhaps because Britain wanted to establish good relations with its former colonies and drive a wedge between America and France. For native peoples living in the territory now claimed by the United States, the treaty was a disaster, as neither Britain nor the Americans consulted them, and their lands were essentially given away without their consent. But for the Americans, the Treaty of Paris was the culmination of 8 years of struggle, a formal acknowledgement that they were now a free and independent nation, recognized by the powers of Europe. But winning independence was only the first challenge. Now the Americans had to figure out how to govern themselves. During the war, the Continental Congress had drafted the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States, which went into effect in 1781. The Articles created a national government, but an extraordinarily weak one. The founders had just fought a war against what they saw as tyrannical central authority, and they were deeply suspicious of concentrated power. So they created a government that had almost no power at all. Under the Articles, there was a Congress, with each state having one vote, but there was no president, no national judiciary, and no ability to enforce laws. Congress could not tax. It could only request money from the states, which often ignored the requests. It could not regulate trade between states or with foreign nations. It could not raise an army without asking the states to provide troops. Major decisions required the agreement of 9 of the 13 states, and any amendment to the Articles required unanimous consent, which proved impossible to achieve. The government under the Articles accomplished some important things, including winning the war and negotiating the Treaty of Paris, and it passed the Northwest Ordinance, which established a process for admitting new states from the Western territories. But overall, the Articles created a government so weak that it could barely function. The states acted almost like independent countries, printing their own money, charging tariffs on goods from other states, and pursuing their own foreign policies. The national government fell deeply into debt and had no way to pay it off. Soldiers who had fought in the war went unpaid. Foreign nations refused to negotiate seriously with a government that seemed unable to enforce its agreements. By the mid-1780s, many American leaders believed the country was on the verge of collapse. The crisis came to a head with Shays' Rebellion, an armed uprising that erupted in western Massachusetts in 1786 and 1787. The rebellion was led by Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Continental Army, and it was driven by economic desperation. Farmers in western Massachusetts were struggling with heavy debts and high taxes imposed by the state government, which was controlled by wealthy merchants and creditors in Boston. When farmers couldn't pay their debts, courts foreclosed on their farms and sometimes sent them to debtors' prison. The farmers petitioned the state government for relief, for paper money that would make debts easier to pay, for lower taxes, for changes to the foreclosure laws. The government ignored them. In frustration, thousands of farmers took up arms, many of them veterans of the Revolution, and began shutting down courthouses to prevent foreclosure proceedings. They believed they were defending their rights and property, just as they had during the revolution. Daniel Shays led a force that attempted to seize a federal arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts, in January 1787, hoping to arm a larger rebellion. They were repulsed by militia artillery, and the rebellion gradually fell apart. Shays and other leaders fled, though most were eventually pardoned. The rebellion itself was not particularly large or long-lasting, but its impact on American politics was enormous. It terrified wealthy elites and national leaders who saw it as evidence that the country was descending into anarchy and mob rule. George Washington, in retirement at Mount Vernon, wrote alarmed letters about the rebellion, fearing that everything they had fought for was unraveling. Shays's rebellion provided powerful ammunition for those who had been arguing that the Articles of Confederation were insufficient, that the country needed a stronger central government capable of maintaining order, enforcing laws, and commanding respect. The rebellion helped spur calls for a convention to revise the Articles, a convention that would instead produce an entirely new constitution. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states, all except Rhode Island, gathered in Philadelphia for what became known as the Constitutional Convention. They met in the same building, Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. The stated purpose was to revise the Articles of Confederation, but it quickly became clear that many delegates had more ambitious plans. Led by figures like James Madison of Virginia and Alexander Hamilton of New York, they set out to create an entirely new framework of government. The convention met in secret, with windows closed and guards at the doors, to allow for frank debate without outside pressure. George Washington presided over the convention, lending his prestige and authority to the proceedings. Over 4 months of intense debate, through the sweltering Philadelphia summer, the delegates hammered out a new constitution. They grappled with fundamental questions. How should states be represented in the national legislature? How should the president be chosen? How much power should the federal government have versus the states? How could they prevent tyranny while creating a government strong enough to be effective? The result was a constitution that created 3 branches of government with checks and balances to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. The legislative branch, Congress, would be divided into 2 houses: the Senate, with equal representation for each state, and the House of Representatives, with representation based on population. The executive branch would be headed by a president, chosen by an electoral college, rather than by direct popular vote. The judicial branch would consist of federal courts, culminating in a Supreme Court. The Constitution gave the federal government significant powers, including the ability to tax, regulate interstate and foreign commerce, and raise armies. But it also limited those powers through enumeration, listing specific things Congress could do, and through a system of checks and balances, ensuring that each branch could constrain the others. The Constitution was a bundle of compromises, including the infamous 3/5 compromise, which counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation, giving extra political power to slave states while denying the humanity of enslaved people. On September 17, 1787, 39 of the remaining delegates signed the Finnish Constitution. It would still need to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states before taking effect, a process that would require another hard-fought campaign of persuasion and debate. But the framework was in place. The United States had created a new form of government, one that balanced federal and state power, separated powers among three branches, and established a system of checks and balances designed to prevent tyranny while enabling effective governance. It was an experiment, untested and uncertain, but it would prove to be one of the most influential and enduring constitutional systems in history.